Thank you. During our time together today, I'd like to ask you to take a virtual trip with me to my home that I share with my husband, Fred Giuffrida, in San Francisco, California. When I invite collectors and art lovers to our home, I usually start by saying, we do not own a collection of greatest hits. Our walls are full of artists that you never heard of. The good news is that today I start the talk by saying, we do not own a collection of greatest hits, and our walls are full of artists you never heard of until recently. So ours is a mission-driven collection with no smaller ambition than to reframe art history and make certain, to the extent of our capabilities and resources, that our artists are put in the full context of a diverse canon. So the collection is 4 generations of artists, beginning in 1945. The work is primarily abstraction, done by artists of African descent, primarily painting. And so against that backdrop, you might wonder why the first slide this lady has up is Pablo Picasso. He's a Spanish guy. Well, this really depicts the beginning of my journey as an art collector, which began with my parents when I was probably around 7 or 8 years old. They thought that a knowledge of culture was a mission-critical exercise, and so I became the poster child for early childhood art education. They immersed me in every aspect of culture. But weekly, I had ballet and music lessons across the street from the Art Institute of Chicago. And between those lessons, I would go visit a few paintings, including this one, that were my absolute favorites. But I think it's fair to say that my favorite painting as a young child was this Seurat. This art had the effect of transporting me to a place that I otherwise could not go. It sparked my imagination and filled me with wonderment. However, what I didn't see with my 8-year-old self in this painting or in the many paintings in museums around the country was my 8-year-old self. There was nobody on the walls that looked like me, and we all want to see ourselves in the culture. Fast forward to when I was at Harvard Business School. I met this wonderful pioneering curator by the name of Lowry Sims. And Lowry shared with me that she thought it was important that I collect art, that when I went off to Wall Street, hopefully I'd have some success, that it was important to remember that. And as I took the journey of collecting, it was really important to sort of, get a posse around me, a group of coaches and experts who could help educate me and guide me through my collecting journey. Fast forward here again, Richard Mayhew was the first artist I got to know personally. And in addition to being mesmerized by the work and fascinated by Richard's personal stories, Richard gave me a gateway into what it was like to live a life of being a creative. He told me stories about the Spiral Collective, which was a group of artists, African-American artists, who would meet in Romare Bearden's studio beginning in about 1960. And they would make art together, but also discuss what it meant to be an artist of color at the dawn of the civil rights movement. Many of these artists worked in the mode of abstraction, and it became clear from the stories that the vast majority of them were mightily overlooked. And so my question was, how could that happen to artists of such skill making work of such quality? The answer formed the foundation of the journey that we continue on to this day, which is they did not conform to expectations on any level. The traditional art world expected African-American artists to be producing identifiably African-American material, primarily figuration. The African-American community was interested in shedding years of stereotypes, so they expected their artists to do the same thing. And so these mostly guys had no reinforcement from the outside world and really got all their sustenance from themselves. For example, if you were in my living room, you would see what my husband and I refer to as the Adam and Eve of our collection. You see Norman Lewis and Alma Thomas here pictured. Norman, for example, had all of the early markers of success. In the 1940s, he was represented by the prestigious Willard Gallery in New York. In 1956, he exhibited this painting alongside Jacob Lawrence and other American artists in the U.S. Pavilion in the 1956 Venice Biennale. Lawrence and Lewis become the first African Americans to achieve that status. Norman is literally at the table, and this is a fairly well-known photograph at the Cedar Tavern in New York City, which was ground zero for the abstract expressionist movement. So Norman is literally part of the conversation of creating the narrative around abstract expressionism. But in this fairly typical depiction of the art historical canon, you see Norman as depicted as a tiny little leaf about to fall to the ground with the acorns and become forgotten. This is what brings us to writing the book that we are just in the process of just publishing at this point in time. When we started collecting, we did not really collect to a theme of intergenerationality. But we believe that one reason the Lewis legacy survived was because he had great influence on particularly the African American painters who came after him. This painting by Jack Whitten is actually one of a series entitled the Norman Lewis Triptychs. They were created after Norman died in 1979. And Jack says in our book that if not for Norman Lewis, he would not have had a career as a painter. This Sam Gilliam painting was recently acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was created in 1970. And the calligraphic mark making is also an homage to Norman. Now, this second generation, which includes Whitten and Gilliam and others, took the notion of innovation to another level. However, they also were up against obstacles with respect to getting their due recognition. So on the left, you see a shaped canvas made in 1957 by Ed Clark. According to James Rondo, who is the director of the Art Institute of Chicago, this is the first known shaped painting. However, we all commonly believe that Frank Stella was the master of this technique, which he didn't really begin making work in this vein until nearly a decade later. Similarly, you see a Jack Whitten painting juxtaposed on a Gerhardt Richter painting. Whitten in the early 1970s begins scraping paint across the canvas. He begins raking paint with rakes and squeegees and even afro combs. But we think of Richter as being an innovator in this area based on his very famous 1980s paintings. This Gilliam drape further underscores how our second generation of artists were key to critical art movements. Sam, beginning in the late 1960s and 1970s, Sam redefines painting by taking paintings off of the canvas. In the late 1960s, Charles Gaines develops a digital aesthetic, and he does this using intricate systems combining math and technology with art. In so doing, he really formulates some of the DNA of the conceptual movement. Now, we all customarily think of history in general and art history in particular, as being up and to the right. But this history for African American artists and artists of the diaspora is not necessarily chronological. So we are very familiar with a certain group of very visible artists working mid-career today. Their names are Mark Bradford, Glenn Ligon, Julie Meritu, Kara Walker, Lorna Simpson, there are others. And so the good news in the art world is that the success of that group of artists has caused the art world to look backward and reevaluate earlier careers. But there's no lack of dialogue between our second and third generations either. You see a Bradford painting made in 2014 in conversation with a Witten painting made in the late 1970s. And also in our book, they sat in my living room and talked about how one influences the other. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we think this is a global story. So from about 6 years ago, we started diversifying our collecting strategy to include a global narrative, and we found some really compelling stories right here in South Africa. I'm just going to quickly share with you a few of my favorites. So this is Xander Blum, Nicholas Shlobo, Mashekwa Longa. There's lots of examples. Serge Alain Nitageka, Robin Rhoda, Mikhail Sabatsky, and Kamung Waluhuliri. Now, it's very encouraging that there are so many green shoots in the art world today. We were really fortunate and pleasantly surprised to find that some of the best and brightest minds working in the art world today were willing to come with us on this journey of creating this book. Now, to put it in context, some of the artists who came to the fore in the 1960s and 70s protested many of the institutions who collaborated with us and them to make this book a reality. So the people who were the protesters are now being exhibited and feted today. But one thing we know about the history of the African diaspora is that it is tenuous and requires diligence. This is where I would invite all of you to come with us on our journey. You don't necessarily need to pursue it in the way that we have pursued it. Find untold stories, underrepresented narratives, and tell those stories. They can be stories of women, of gay people, of regional artists. Use your curatorial skill, your artistic skill, your philanthropy, and your stewardship to tell these stories. Our global culture will be richer as a result, and we think that's an effort worth pursuing. Thank you very much for your time.